All right. So yeah, thanks for the intro. I guess Jolene already told you all about me. So before I was working for Cuban, I was a postdoc at McGill in Robert Sartori's lab. And before that, I was a PhD student in Leipzig. So I've kind of been where many of you are today, which I hope gives me a little bit of insight about what it's like to be a student who might want to, communicate their research to a lay audience and kind of improve their science communication skills. So yeah, let's get started. Oops, not letting me click. There we go. So the learning objectives for today, you probably saw them in the ad for the workshop, but basically we're going to talk about first how to identify a topic that you might want to write about for a lay audience. Then we're going to touch on how to structure your piece, and then how to write in a way that's more accessible and engaging for a general audience, and also how to kind of edit your own writing to make it more engaging. I don't know why my keyboard's not letting me click. There we go. So scientists are generally considered to be pretty bad communicators. You probably heard that before. I think this is partly because we're only ever really taught to communicate with each other and not to a lay audience, and also partly because we get really stuck in our own little bubbles of knowledge that we kind of forget how specialized our knowledge and the language we use to describe it really is. So sort of something I call the curse of academia is that the more you know about something, the less you remember how difficult it was to learn. And that makes it harder to communicate with someone who's outside of your own like circle of knowledge. And because of this, scientists have certain habits that are kind of like accepted rules for scientific communications. We tend to use overly formal language that's full of jargon and in-speak. We're typically modest and we avoid saying things like I did or we did because we think it sounds kind of arrogant. And in science, like what was discovered is a lot more important than who it was that discovered it, at least in the written form. And we tend to aim to be unbiased. Obviously, we don't want to bias our research, so we tend to use the passive voice rather than the active voice in our writing. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later and what we can do about it. But basically, when switching from scientific to lay audience writing, we need to try to unlearn these habits of scientific writing. Lay writing is obviously very different from academic writing. And one of the things that I think is fun about it is that there really are no rules in lay audience writing. You're completely free to write whatever or however you want. If you want to add a joke, you can do that. If you want to write grammatically incorrect sentences to try to get a point across better, you can do that. If you want to write a piece that's full of your opinions and not that many facts, you can do that too. Although that one I might not necessarily recommend. You still want some facts to back up your argument. But really the only consequence for writing the way that you want is that you have to be prepared to deal with people who might disagree with you or who don't necessarily like what you have to say. You also don't have to be an expert in what you're writing. You just have to be able to understand what it is that you're writing about. So don't think that you're not qualified to write about topics that are outside of your own specific research domain. It's really more about being able and capable of understanding different topics and then explaining them well, than it is about being an expert in that topic. People also don't have to keep reading, right? In the same way that you as a writer have a lot more freedom to express yourself the way that you want when you're writing for a lay audience, your readers also have the freedom to dismiss you, right? They don't have to keep reading, they can stop at any time. So given this, every sentence really needs to be engaging if you do want people to keep reading your piece. And you want to make sure that even if people stop reading, they still take something away from your piece. So you almost can't start the piece too quickly, right? You want your first sentence to be snappy and engaging. And yeah, you have to keep people engaged throughout what you're writing. Lastly, also don't overestimate the importance of being a good writer. So like if you're someone who doesn't consider yourself to be a good writer, first of all, you can improve your writing skills. And second of all, a really well-written piece can still be super boring if the topic is boring, right? And a piece that's kind of okay written can still be really interesting and engaging if the topic itself lends itself to that and if you find an interesting way of explaining things. So, if you don't think that you're a good writer, don't worry about that. Don't let that stop you from trying to write for a lay audience. One of the big differences from my perspective between academic writing and lay audience writing is this thing that I call zooming out rather than in. So the biggest difference between scientific and lay audience writing is really the perspective from which you're approaching a subject. So in academic research and publishing, it's really all about learning more and more about one very specific topic and kind of zooming in on the subject, right? As you progress in your academic career, you're becoming an expert in something super specific. But when writing for a lay audience, or a non-expert audience, you really have to zoom out and see the bigger picture to try to contextualize the research and answer the question of why you're doing what you're doing. And in this case, what you're doing is less important than why you're doing it, right? No one outside of your field of expertise really cares that much why you used one piece of software over another, or what the name of your analysis algorithm is. They want to know why you're doing what you're doing, why it's important, and how it relates to their own lives. And doing this kind of exercise of zooming out is not only good for the reader and helping them understand what you're talking about, but it's also going to help you understand your own research or understanding the research that you're writing about. So as scientists, we often get super focused on the what and the how, because that's what we're supposed to write about in a scientific paper, and we kind of lose sight of the why, right? Like, why is it that money is going towards this research, and what is it that makes this research important and interesting, and why should a lay audience care about it? So now that we've decided that we want to write something for a lay audience, how do we decide what exactly it is that we want to write about without ending up trying to write an entire PhD thesis in a blog post, right? So a good place to start is to start thinking about your own research, but really it can be kind of overwhelming, right? When someone says, tell me about your research, you're kind of like, whoa, that's a lot, right? Your research encompasses so much, and it's kind of overwhelming to just tell somebody, right, about their research. And the good news is that a good article for a lay audience is at most one idea. Research isn't, obviously your PhD thesis or your postdoc research is not just one idea. So you're going to have to pick one single idea in order to write a piece that's interesting and engaging. The key here is really to try to avoid explaining your entire research agenda in one post, and instead picking one interesting but simple question that's relevant to your research and to try to answer that one question. Your blog post is not a PhD thesis. It's your opportunity to try to tell someone something interesting in about 5 to 8 minutes, right? They don't have all day. They want a short piece that is engaging and interesting for them. So a tip that I've heard is that you should be able to tell your story in 10 words or less. And that if you can't do this, you haven't distilled your topic enough. Personally, I think that, 10 words is maybe a little bit short. It's a bit harsh. But let's say maybe 15 or 20 or so. Basically, the point is if you can't state your point in 1 or 2 sentences, then like you need to narrow it down a little bit more, because you're trying to approach a too big of a topic for a single piece. So first we have to decide what kind of piece we want to write. Do you want to just educate your readers, about a particular topic? That would be what I call an explainer piece. So this type of piece is like purely factual. It aims to teach the reader about something, right? If your aim is only to explain something, then one thing that you should do is to try to think about whether the topic you've chosen is interesting enough on its own to engage readers, or, in some cases, it might only be interesting to someone who already has an interest in that topic. If you're going to try to explain what MRI is, then, fellow students might be more interested in reading this than a general audience. But also think about whether the written format is the most engaging way to teach this topic, right? Sometimes an infographic or a video or a podcast is a better way to try and just teach someone about a topic than a written piece where they might lose interest quickly. So that's just something to consider. Explainer pieces are absolutely an option, and they're a great way to teach the public about specific topics. But one thing that you can do to help make your written piece a little bit more appealing to a wider audience is to think more deeply about the eventual outcomes or the aims of your research, and to then share your opinion about it through an op-ed style or opinion piece. So pieces like this are generally centered around some sort of argument, and they aim to explain to readers why this topic matters, how it links to the bigger picture, and how it could lead to some sort of change in the real world, right? So we're trying to connect a topic that relates to your research to the bigger picture so that people are already more interested in it. So I'm going to focus on this format because it's generally a little bit more challenging to structure than just an explainer. So a couple of examples. If your research topic is something like understanding the interplay between emotion and decision-making processes with a particular emphasis on how emotional states influence risk perception and decision outcomes, right? Kind of a mouthful, but that might be the topic of a PhD thesis, right? So if you want to try to write a blog post or an opinion piece about this, you got to pick one idea and try to link it to a bigger picture. So for example, it's important to consider emotional factors in decision-making frameworks like policy and the justice system. So we've kind of taken one aspect of the research topic and we're linking it to something in the real world that people might have an interest in. Another example, if your research topic is something like investigating the neural mechanisms underlying memory consolidation during sleep with a focus on the role of hippocampal replay and its interaction with cortical oscillations, right? Again, kind of a mouthful, but a perfectly decent PhD thesis topic. But one idea for a blog post might be that the educational system would benefit from integrating sleep-based memory consolidation practices, such as starting school a bit later to allow adolescents to sleep longer, or integrating nap time for younger students. So again, you're taking an idea that's part of your research and you're linking it to something in the real world that people would have an interest or an opinion about, and you're sharing your opinion about that thing. So now we've decided what type of piece we want to write and what kind of topic we want to write about. So it's time to start thinking about how you're going to structure your piece into a coherent story. So for this section, I'm going to focus on op-ed style pieces, since I think those are the most challenging to structure. And so in scientific writing, we generally follow the same format, right? We follow the rules of the scientific process, which are introduction, methods, results, conclusions. That's just what we do, right? It's the right thing to do when you're writing a scientific piece. When writing for a lay audience, obviously the format's a lot more flexible than academic writing, but the structure is still really important. If your piece seems like an incoherent train of thought, people are going to lose interest really quickly. They're going to stop reading. Readers really want to feel like you're going somewhere with your piece. So one way to make sure that your topic is interesting enough to engage the readers throughout the piece is to try to follow what we call the 3-beat structure, which is a structure that's used in op-ed or opinion piece writing. So the 3 beats are, here's what I'm talking about, here's the complexity of the issue, and then here's how we can solve it. So this is by no means the only correct way to structure a good piece for a lay audience, but it's a kind of structure that we can try to work with for most topics. As long as you've identified some sort of problem or an opinion that you want to share with the world, then this structure will help you kind of create a good flow in your piece. So let's go through each beat in a little bit more detail. So beat 1, here's what I'm talking about, is obviously your introduction. It should be kind of like a roadmap for the journey you're about to take your reader on through your writing, right? It should connect your specific topic to a bigger picture, whether it's climate change, public health, evolution, whatever it is. You want to try to connect your research topic or your topic that you're writing about to some sort of bigger picture that people care about. It should also state your news hook, right? Your news hook is basically, what do you want to share with the world? Why is this important? How do the results of your research link and connect to these global challenges that are facing everybody? Is this a new idea? How is this idea different from other arguments that have already been presented about this topic before? Beat number 2, here's the complexity of the issue. So this is where you want to then like present the evidence in support of whatever you're arguing for, right? It's a good idea to aim to have at least 3 points of evidence, but this is going to vary depending on your topic and how much research has already been done on this topic. If it's a brand new area of research, there might not be an overwhelming amount of evidence to share, but you can then talk about, for example, the next steps in that research or your own opinion on that topic. If you're sharing an opinion about your topic, it's always a good idea to try to kind of predict what someone who would disagree with you might say, and then acknowledge the validity of that viewpoint, and then present a counter argument against it, right? So you're basically saying, I know someone's going to criticize me. This is what I think they're going to say, and here's what I would say against them, to support your own argument. And all of this together is kind of explaining the complexity of the issue. So that's the main chunk of your piece. And then last but not least is beat number 3, which is here's how we can solve it, right? So this is basically the conclusion of your piece. And full disclosure, everyone knows conclusions are really hard, right? Like we were taught in school that you just kind of like summarize what you've already written in the piece. But a good article has a conclusion that doesn't just summarize, but it contextualizes what you're talking about, right? Your goal is to leave the reader with something to think about and not just a rundown of what you've already said. This is also where you would place your kind of call to action if you have one. So why did you spend all the time that you spent doing this research? And what is it that you want your readers or decision makers in your community to do with this information? Like, what can we do to make real change out of whatever it is that you're presenting? The end of your piece can also look towards the future. So like, what are the implications if this finding holds up? What other research do we need to do? And sometimes this beat or the solution to the problem is often that like more research is needed, right? This is a new topic. We need to do a whole bunch more research to get answers, and that's fine, right? Like sometimes that is the answer is more research. And sometimes you have an opinion about the solution that you wouldn't be able to state in an academic paper because the evidence just isn't there yet to back it up. But this is your chance to kind of share that, right? Especially if you're writing about your own research, you are an expert in this topic and you're allowed to share your opinion about it. Open-ended conclusions are okay. So like if more research is needed is kind of your conclusion, that's okay. But try to resist the urge to just like pile up a bunch of rhetorical questions at the end of your piece. This is usually a sign that things have gotten a little bit unfocused. So try to avoid this, right? You don't want to leave the reader with more questions than answers, even though it's okay to leave it somewhat open-ended. So now that you've decided on the general structure of your piece, it's time to actually start writing, right? So for the next little while, I'm going to go through some tips and tricks that you can use to make your writing a little bit more accessible to a general audience than how you're probably used to writing in the academic context. And I'll show you some examples of how you can use these tips to edit your own writing, whether it's a blog post, an opinion piece, or a lay abstract or whatever. These are tricks that you can use for any type of writing. So if you want the reader to truly understand how a problem affects real people, you should tell a story about real people, right? If you don't have a personal story to tell, you can just kind of make one up. And I'm not saying like you should lie and say all these things happened to you if they didn't, but you can make up a character and tell their story, or you can ask the reader to kind of imagine themselves in a particular situation to sort of paint a picture around whatever it is that you're talking about so that the reader is already engaged in what you're saying. Personal anecdotes are super good tools when writing for the public because they bring people into the writing and allow them to kind of feel themselves in the shoes of whatever topic you're writing about. Some of my own most popular blog pieces and also my favorite ones to write have been ones where I kind of tell a story about something that happened in my life, but I try to analyze it from like a psychology or cognitive science perspective to try to understand my own emotions and my own behaviors and explain them like in a sciencey way. Obviously, not every topic lends itself to that type of a piece, but if you can add some sort of story that feels natural, don't hesitate to do that. Like it'll help people relate to your piece and it'll help them be more engaged throughout. It doesn't have to be long and complicated, and it doesn't even have to be true, right? It just needs to be something that allows them to paint a picture that they can visualize while they're reading. To find your voice, write like you speak. And I mean this in like the most literal sense that you could possibly take it, right? If you're kind of stuck, you don't know where to start with your writing, a good trick that I use is to imagine a conversation that you're having with like a close friend or a family member. If they imagine they asked you about your research, right? What are you doing in your PhD or your postdoc research? And literally write down how you would say it to them, right? And that's going to be a totally different tone than how you would write if you just started writing. It's a lot easier to take, the voice that you write down and make it more formal if you need to than it is to take formal writing and make it more casual and easy to understand. So it's just a trick that you can use if you're kind of stuck. It's a good trick to get you started. Also, don't be afraid of emotions, right? You're human, so are your readers. People connect to topics that they can relate to, so you can help them do that by connecting through emotions, right? If you're writing about dementia, most people know an older person who suffers from dementia, and you can kind of use that, right? It's maybe it feels exploitative, but it's not. It's just helping them connect to the topic that you're writing about by reminding them that these are problems that affect real people. An example of how we can add a personal anecdote to some writing to make it a little bit more engaging. So this is a couple sentences about photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is the biochemical process by which plants convert light energy into chemical energy, turning their leaves green. This process occurs in specialized structures called chloroplasts, where chlorophyll pigments absorb light energy and initiate a series of reactions that ultimately produce oxygen as a byproduct, right? It's not a bad piece of writing. It's relatively easy to understand by a lay audience, but we can add a little bit of a personal touch to try to paint a better picture and engage the reader more. So for example, picture yourself walking through a lush, sun-dappled forest on a warm summer day. The leaves rustle gently in the breeze and almost sparkle in different shades of green as the sun hits them. The colors you see are the result of photosynthesis, the process by which plants harness the power of sunlight to produce the oxygen we breathe, unfolding quietly within tiny structures called chloroplasts in every green leaf. So by kind of telling the reader to imagine themselves in this situation and describing it in detail, you've already engaged them just a little bit better in this scientific topic that you're trying to explain. A good tip also is you want to explain, right? You don't want to dumb something down. Readers don't want dumbed down versions of topics. They want great explanations of complex topics, complex issues that they're interested in, right? Assume that your reader is smart, but uninformed about this particular topic. Don't leave out complex details. Instead, find a way to try to explain them. If you skip over the complexity, it's going to be less interesting, and the tone might end up being a little bit condescending, right? Like your reader might know more than you think that they do, so you don't want to leave out the complexity. You just want to find a good way to explain it. A good way to summarize this is to say to be scholarly but not scholastic. You also want to avoid jargon at all costs, so we'll talk a little bit more about jargon in a minute. Introduce really only the most essential complex words and find a better way to explain the others. Check and recheck your writing for jargon. It can be difficult to recognize sometimes, and people will lose interest super fast if there's a bunch of words in your writing that they don't understand. They'll just give up and move on. They don't have to keep reading again. So a little bit more about jargon and InSpeak. So jargon has a place, right? Like it's useful within the scientific community if you want to quickly convey complex topics to your peers. As students in science, we spend a whole lot of time like learning the language of our field. And so really we've earned the right to speak that language when we're in a scientific context, right? At a conference or whatever. It's appropriate. It's appropriate to use jargon with your peers. But if you're writing for a lay audience, it's just a different situation, right? Jargon is the opposite of useful when you're communicating with anyone who's outside of your circle of knowledge. Some jargon is easy to spot. Basically, any words that are not commonly used outside of the scientific context are jargon. But as scientists, we also sometimes use common words in a way that isn't common, right? So we might use terms that are commonly used, but we mean something different by them because we're using them in the scientific context. And this is known as InSpeak, right? So here are some examples of InSpeak that might help you look out for a similar thing in your own writing. So for example, you might refer to a quote unquote positive trend in your research, which if you use that term in common language, people would assume that positive means good, right? But in your research, it just means a trend that's going upwards. So it's a good idea to look out for those types of InSpeak terms in addition to jargon, because they might complicate your writing in a way that isn't super obvious because they're not necessarily jargon terms. So here's an example. full of jargon. The dopaminergic system, centered around the neurotransmitter dopamine, plays a key role in reward processing and motivation. Dysfunction of the dopaminergic system has been implicated in various neuropsychiatric disorders, including Parkinson's disease and schizophrenia. Again, not a bad sentence in a scientific context, but it's full of jargon that might be a little much for a lay audience. Dopaminergic system, neurotransmitter, reward processing, neuropsychiatric disorders, even just dysfunction implicated in all of those are terms that are not necessarily used in the same way or used at all in common language. So we could try to rewrite it. The brain's reward system, which relies on a chemical messenger called dopamine, is crucial for feeling pleasure and staying motivated. Scientists believe that problems like Parkinson's disease and schizophrenia are related to the system not working right. So, whether or not this is the perfect sentence is different, but to illustrate, we've tried to sort of replace a lot of these jargon terms with simpler terms, or at least more understandable terms. So dopaminergic system becomes brain's reward system. Neurotransmitter becomes chemical messenger. Reward processing becomes feeling pleasure. And neuropsychiatric disorders becomes problems, right? Which might be an oversimplification in certain contexts, but you are the judge of whether a simple term like problem is enough in this context. And personally, I think it is, right? A problem like Parkinson's or schizophrenia is an appropriately simple term to use in this case. And dysfunction also, we've changed it to not working right, which again could be an oversimplification and might not be the right, might be too simple to use in certain contexts, but in this case, I think it works. So a few more details that do make a difference in your writing. You want to try to keep your paragraphs super short and digestible, much shorter than an academic writing. So stick to like 2 to 4 sentences maximum, especially if you're writing for a blog post or anything that's going to be posted online. And this is partly because it's just visually much easier to read writing online when it's short paragraphs versus when you have to kind of scroll to get to the next section. That way people can kind of take breaks in between and it makes it more engaging. It's okay to use the first person. So people connect to people. Let the audience get to know you a little bit better as a scientist and a person by sort of taking credit for the research that you've done, right? It's okay to say, I think that, or we looked at, if you're the one doing the research. Related to this also is you want to avoid using the passive voice, right? So instead of saying, Hey Jude was written by the Beatles, you would say the Beatles wrote Hey Jude. That's called the active voice. When the passive voice is used in scientific articles, it's kind of like saying, any person who followed the protocols that we described would have found the same result. So it doesn't matter that I did it. It's just what was done, right? But when we're writing for the public, your readers do care who did it and why, right? They might be more interested if they know who you are and that you're the scientist who did it. And so using the active voice makes it a little bit more relatable and engaging for your reader. So an example of first person and active voice. The data were analyzed to determine the relationship between caffeine consumption and sleep quality. A correlation was found between higher caffeine intake and poorer sleep quality among participants. So this is like a standard scientific 2 sentences with the passive voice, right? The data were analyzed, a correlation was found. So if we change it then to the first person and active voice, we'd say, I then analyzed the data to investigate the relationship between caffeine consumption and sleep quality. I discovered that higher caffeine intake is associated with poor sleep quality among participants. So already people are a little bit more engaged because they know that you did it. You're the person who did this research. Sometimes you're not the person who did the research though, right? Sometimes you're going to be writing about someone else's research and you can still use this trick to engage readers a little bit more by kind of stating their name, right? So Dr. Latte and her team then analyzed the data to investigate the relationship between caffeine consumption and sleep quality. What they discovered was that higher caffeine intake is associated with poor sleep quality among participants. So by saying they and the name of the researcher, again, you're like putting a human touch on your writing to engage people a little bit more. Last but not least, referencing. Students often ask me like what format of referencing they should use for example, a blog post. The good news is that for blogging, it's a million times easier than it is for academic writing, right? Hyperlinks are the way to go. Of course, You still need to cite your sources and give credit where it's due, but there's no need to overdo it. Too many links or references can be overwhelming, and not every statement requires a reference. So if you didn't need to look it up when you wrote it, you might not need to reference it, right? So for example, bananas are yellow when they're ripe. You don't really need to reference that. Like everybody knows that a banana is yellow when they're ripe. And if you tried to find research on that, you'd find like 100 research papers versus just one that found that, right? To me, bananas are ripe when they're yellow with just a tinge of green. That's an opinion, right? It's not a fact. It's your opinion on how bananas are ripe. So you don't really need to reference that either. But if you say something like the vast majority of bananas sold in Canada turn brown before they're consumed, you should probably reference that, right? There's some statistics in there. You probably need a factual paper or, some sort of research that states that so people know you're not just making things up. Yeah, so lastly, don't let the link do any expository work for you. Make sure that everything in your writing makes sense and reads well, even without the link. Sometimes when you add a link, you are tempted to kind of rewrite the sentence. Try to avoid doing that. You want to write the sentence and then you add in the link wherever it makes sense and not the other way around. So an example of this, pumpkin spice lattes are a treat enjoyed by many people in the United States with a reference. In recent studies, scientists found that when given a choice, giraffes consistently chose pumpkin spice lattes over water with a reference. If we're doing this in a blog post, you can shorten it a little bit by removing some of the superfluous references. So pumpkin spice lattes are a treat enjoyed by many. That doesn't really need a reference, right? Everyone knows that. In a 2023 study, scientists found that when given the choice, adult giraffes consistently chose pumpkin spice lattes over water. So that part does need a reference, but it makes it a little bit less imposing by just doing it as a hyperlink that people can choose to click if they want or not, right? You don't want them to have to click the link to learn more about whatever you're saying. The last thing I want to touch on a little bit today is the hot topic of generative AI, like ChatGPT. So a friend of mine who I did some like freelance writing for his company, he recently asked me if I was worried that generative AI would replace jobs like mine. And I guess he thought that my writing was a much bigger part of my job than it is. I do a lot of writing, but I do so many other things. So no, I don't think that ChatGPT will replace my job. And I kind of laughed because if anything, it's been a super useful tool for me and it makes me more efficient at certain things. But it's also super important to recognize that it's very bad at certain other things. So I wanted to go through just a quick list of some basic do's and don'ts for using AI as a writing tool. So do not obviously ask it to generate long text for you. Don't just say, write me a blog post, right, about this topic. It's going to do a terrible job and it's going to lie to you. It's going to put in a bunch of facts that are not true. You're going to have to fact check it. Not recommended. Don't ever copy paste generated output directly, again, because it will lie to you. And also because generative AI tends to have like a specific voice. It tends to be like over enthusiastic about certain things. If you copy paste text, you're going to lose your own voice, right? You want your writing to sound like you. You don't want it to sound like a robot. So not recommended. Don't ever trust any facts that you didn't give it yourself, right? It will make things up. And if you absolutely have to ask it some facts, just make sure that you fact check them because they may not be true. And don't come to rely on it for your writing, right? Don't get lazy. If you want to improve your writing, you still have to write it yourself, right? But there are many ways that we can use things like ChatGPT to help us, right? If we're stuck, we're having a bit of writer's block, we don't really know how to start a blog post, for example, you can feed it some content. You can feed it some facts and use it for like small chunks of text at a time just to get yourself started. So like, give me 2 sentences about this topic, but make sure that you tell it exactly what you want it to say. Or again, it will make things up. Do feed it text that you wrote and ask it, for example, to proofread your work. You can ask it to make text gender neutral or apply certain grammatical rules. It's good at those types of things, but you do have to feed it your text, right? You can't just tell it to produce text for you. You have to feed it something that you wrote, and then it can help you to kind of proofread your writing. And you can also ask it to identify and replace jargon words. It won't always be super good at this, but it will help you to identify them and kind of check, how accessible the writing that you've already produced is. And the biggest tip here is to always give it super detailed prompts to get the best possible output. If you just say, like, write me 2 sentences on X, it's not going to do a very good job. But if you give it more information and, like, I want the tone to be like this, and I want it to use this type of grammar, it's going to do a better job of giving you what you want. So just some tips on like how you can use these tools in your favor. But again, don't rely on them, right? And don't let them do your writing for you, or you're not really going to learn very much. So to conclude, like, how do you get started, right? You want to write for the public, but like, where do you write? So you could start your own blog. You can do that for free on WordPress or like Medium. My advice would be, if you do want to start blogging, start one with a couple of friends, like a couple PhD students or postdocs who also want to do that, because when you start one yourself, you feel this pressure to like post super regular content. If you take turns with your friends, then you can start something that gains momentum by sharing the work between you. Or you can also contribute to an existing organization's blog. So like the Cuban blog that I've been running for a couple of years. Many student groups, research networks, conference groups have their own blogs, and I'm sure that they would love to have your input. So like do get in touch with those types of organizations. So that's kind of it for me. I have some practice exercises that we can do. So maybe I'll